Hey friends, it's Corey from Hey Let's Make Stuff. In today's video, I wanted to go back to the basics of sublimation. In our sublimation Facebook groups, we have been finding that a lot of people are getting into sublimation without really knowing some of the limitations and other things they need to know when starting out with sublimation. This can lead to a lot of disappointment when people figure out they can't use certain colors or certain materials. And so in this video, I wanted to give you basically the basics of sublimation so that you can know what it is going into it so you won't be disappointed later. So in this class, we're going to go over 5 basic things you need to know before you start sublimation crafting. That way you can decide if it's the right craft for you. Before we get into those 5 things, let's start with a basic overview of sublimation. So sublimation is a printer craft. You will print out a design on your sublimation printer, and then using your heat press, you will apply it to a blank. And there are a huge variety of blanks. This is just a very, very small portion of some of the things you can make, and I will talk a little bit more about blanks later in this video. But as you can see here, you can make all sorts of things. You can make all sorts of apparel, you can make bookmarks that I'm knocking down, you can make signs, patches, all sorts of drinkware, tiles. There is so much you can make with sublimation. All right, let's get into the 5 things you need to know before you start this craft. The first thing we need to talk about is printers. There are sort of 2 options when it comes to choosing a sublimation printer. You can choose a sublimation specific printer. Right here I have a Sawgrass printer, or you can convert an Epson EcoTank printer by putting sublimation ink in it. Epson does also make a sublimation printer, the F170 and the F570. I don't actually have one of those, so I can't show you it here, but it is sort of in between these 2 machines, as you'll see. Let's start with the Sawgrass. So Sawgrass makes sublimation specific printers, and I really like them. This is an SG1000. It prints up to 11 by 17. There is a smaller one, the SG500, which prints up to 8 by 13. So either one will work. I started out with the smaller one and then upgraded because I wanted those bigger prints. Some of the pros to this machine is that it is a sublimation specific printer. It is designed to do sublimation, which means you don't have to mess with a lot of the settings. There is quite a bit more work that goes into getting a converted printer working, as you'll see, but if you get a Sawgrass, it should work really well for you right out of the box. This printer also does its own maintenance. So once or twice a day, it powers on, it pushes a little bit of ink through the lines to protect it from getting clogs. And should you ever have a problem, they really do have really good technical support. Another benefit of the Sawgrass printer is that they have their own software built into it. So they have DesignMate, which is where you can use templates and do your designs. And then they have PrintMate, which is a simple printing software. Makes it really easy to print designs that you've purchased elsewhere and just want to print on your printer. The biggest con with the Sawgrass is going to be the price. It's going to be the most expensive option. Not only is the printer expensive, but the inks are expensive as well. Then let's jump over to this converted printer. So basically this is an Epson EcoTank printer. You can get these at Costco or Office Max or Amazon, any of those places. Any EcoTank will work, but honestly, get one of the cheaper ones. You don't need like faxing and copying and all of those other features that come on the higher end Epson EcoTanks. So go ahead and find yourself an Epson EcoTank, and then you can buy ink to put in it on Amazon. So basically, you're just putting sublimation ink into this printer. The biggest pro is that this is a much cheaper option. You can get one of these printers usually for under $200. The ink is not very expensive, so you can start sublimating at a fairly low cost of entry. And if you can get your settings dialed in, you can print just as well with this printer as you can with this printer. The problem is, and the biggest cons are, getting the settings dialed into this can be difficult. It's not always difficult, but it can be difficult. So this is actually my second Epson EcoTank conversion. My first one worked really, really well right out of the box. This is the same exact printer, and I struggle every time I print to get the right color. This is because this printer doesn't understand that it has sublimation ink in it. So it's still trying to lay down the ink as though it's the regular Epson ink and not sublimation ink, which has a totally different formulation. So a lot of times with a converted printer, you can have issues, especially with your color. There are ways to try and fix that, but they can be overwhelming to some new users. Because you're putting sublimation ink into a printer that's not designed for it, Epson's warranty and service, they go out the window. They're not going to help you at all with this, so you're kind of on your own. Online groups, especially on Facebook, can be helpful, but again, this can be a struggle. Another thing about the converted Epson, and this can be a pro or a con, is that it doesn't come with any software, so you have to choose your software. If you're familiar with graphic design software, easy peasy. If you're not, it can be a little bit more intimidating. But you can print with everything from Google Docs all the way to Photoshop. I've printed with 12 different softwares to this printer, so I know that there will be one that will work for you. Another con for this printer is that it doesn't perform any kind of maintenance, and sublimation ink is just more viscous than regular ink, and so these tend to get clogged a lot more easily. It happens here, but this runs its own maintenance, but this doesn't. So you will need to be printing at least once a week to make sure that this doesn't clog. Then there is the Epson F170 and F570 printers, which are sublimation specific Epson printers, and they sort of fall in between these two printers. So those printers have their color dialed in, so you shouldn't have any color issues. The price point is between these two machines, so you're not gonna pay as much as a Sawgrass, but you are gonna pay more than you would for a cheap little Epson EcoTank. And because it's a sublimation printer, and Epson knows it's a sublimation printer, you should have access to their support. There are a few things that make that F170 or F570 similar to the Epson EcoTank. One is that you don't get that software, so you'll have to choose a software to work with. And then the second is that it doesn't perform its own maintenance. Now, I chatted with some folks at Epson and they say that it shouldn't need maintenance. They've actually designed the print heads to be a little wider or larger so that the more viscous ink doesn't clog quite as easily. That being said, I know people who have that printer and it gets clogged. So you may still want to be printing regularly to make sure that you don't have those clogs, since it won't run its maintenance automatically. Choosing the right printer can make or break your projects. So I would say if you can afford it, I would get a sublimation specific printer, either the Sawgrass or the Epson, just because it is so much easier to dial in that color properly. But if you can't and you need a budget entry-level option, then you can definitely try working with the Epson EcoTank. It just may require a little bit more work on your part. Second, let's talk about Sublimation Ink. There are just a few things you should know about Sublimation Ink before you decide if this is the right craft for you. First is that Sublimation Ink is permanent, and that is awesome. So if you're coming from a cutting machine world and you're used to HTV that cracks or peels over time and you're just tired of that, Sublimation Ink actually bonds with whatever you're putting it on and makes it permanent. There are some caveats to that, and we will talk about them later in this video, but just know that this is a really great option for permanent, vivid images. The second thing you need to know is that Sublimation Ink is transparent, which means that it needs to go on a white or light colored blank. Think of it sort of like a highlighter. If you highlight something on a white page, you can totally see it, but if you highlight it on black, you can't see it at all. We will talk a little bit more about this when we talk about blanks here in a little bit. Third, you'll notice that there is no white ink here. So people are always asking, how can I print white on a dark shirt? You can't, because there is no white ink in a sublimation printer. Any white in your image is going to be the same color as your blank. Another thing to know is that your print is going to look terrible right out of the printer. It's going to look dull, your colors are going to be off, it's just going to look really terrible, and you're not going to know how it's actually going to look until you press it to something using that high heat. So I have a recommendation that I recommend to every sublimation crafter, and that is that you do a test print of whatever project you're working on and get some really cheap polyester fabric and test press your projects. Once you test press it, you can see if your color is correct or if you need to go back into your software and do any modifications to your color. It's a lot cheaper than pressing it onto a very expensive blank and realizing everything is wrong. So just know that what you see out of the printer is not what you're going to get until you press it on your blank. And then finally, like I said earlier, the inks that you put into the Epson EcoTank printer to convert it really mess with the color management. The printer thinks that it has Epson inks in it, but it has these other inks in it, and it just doesn't know how to lay down that color. So you are going to have to go in and mess with the colors a little bit. There are lots of tutorials about how to do that online. I've got a very popular tutorial on how to do it on my YouTube channel, but it definitely requires a little bit more if you're using that converted printer. The next thing we need to talk about is sublimation blanks. Sublimation blanks have two things in common. The first is that they are light in color, like I mentioned earlier, usually white, but sometimes other light colors. And then number two is that they are polyester or poly-coated. There are so many sublimation blanks out there now that sublimation has become more popular. I have just a handful here to show you. I've got some drinkware here, including a glass tumbler, which is really fun. There's a ton of apparel. Again, it needs to be white or polyester. Generally, I say 100% polyester. You can go down as low as 65% polyester, but the lower you go, the more vintage faded look you're gonna get, just because sublimation ink needs to be able to bond with that polyester fabric. I also have a fun little cheese board, neoprene items like can koozies or this mouse pad, pet items, coasters, like little zippered pouches. I've got some pot holders. I've got a sparkly sublimation pillowcase. There are so many things you can sublimate, which really just expands the number of things that you can make. When you're shopping for sublimation blanks, look for two things. If you're shopping for apparel, just look for that polyester content. It doesn't have to say that it's for sublimation. It can, of course, but if you find a shirt that's not labeled for sublimation, but it's, 65% polyester or higher, it will work. If you're looking for hard blanks for sublimation, they definitely need to be labeled for sublimation. You can't walk into your Dollar Tree, walk out with a mug, and be able to sublimate it. It doesn't have the right coating on it. Each sublimation blank is different, and how you press it is going to be different. And we will talk about pressing later in this video, but a good place to start is to read the manufacturer's instructions. Again, we'll talk about those more in a little bit. The fourth thing we need to talk about is images. If you're coming from a cutting machine background, you are probably familiar with SVG files, and you can sublimate SVG files. However, there is so much more you can do with sublimation than just using those crafting machine files. I'm going to get a little technical here, but I wanted to talk about the two types of images you might see. So an SVG file is a vector file. That means that it can be scaled infinitely. You can make it really small, you can put it up on a billboard, and it will look good no matter what. It doesn't lose resolution or quality. Vector files are generally designed in a vector software like Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape. Then there are bitmap files, and these are files that are made up of pixels, so JPEGs, PNGs. And that is generally what you're looking for with sublimation. You can sublimate the SVG, though I highly recommend you save it to a PNG first, just because some software has a difficult time if the SVG has layers built into it. But really you're wanting to look for a high quality PNG. And here's the difference. So in the overhead shot here, you can see that the image on the left here is a PNG sublimation image, and the image on the right here is an SVG image that I've applied with HTV. This is one of those things that can really show you how much more you can do with sublimation than you can with HTV. So HTV, I could have done, several colors. I could have done a patterned HTV, but that's about it. But with the sublimation side here, you can see that I was able to create like a watercolor background. I was able to add this very intricate pattern to the letters. It's just so much more that I can do with sublimation images than I can do with SVGs. Most SVGs won't have patterns or the grunge look or watercolor effects or any of those other details that you get so much better in a PNG bitmap image. You can also use the full spectrum of colors in sublimation printing, whereas you are limited to whatever color HTV you have. So while you can use all of those SVGs you already have, if you get a sublimation printer, you may want to start looking for sublimation specific designs. Basically PNGs, because you can just do so much more with them. Etsy has a ton, Design Bundles, Creative Fabrica. A lot of these sites have ones that you could just buy and print and put on a garment. So if you want to get into sublimation, yes, you can use all those SVG files that you already have for your electronic cutter, but you may also want to start looking at getting PNG images just because they are so much more interesting than flat SVG images. The last thing you need to know about sublimation printing has to do with pressing. So if you are a Cricut or silhouette crafter, you probably already have some sort of heat press, whether it's an easy press, a traditional heat press, a mug press, a tumbler press. There are lots of ways that you can use what you already have for sublimation. If you have a Cricut Easy Press, you can use it, but you need to make sure you have the Cricut Easy Press 2 or 3. The original Cricut Easy Press doesn't get hot enough, about 400 degrees, to do sublimation, but if you do have that Cricut Easy Press 2 or Easy Press 3, you should be able to do some sublimation projects. There are some sublimation projects that will be a little difficult with that press just because they require more pressure, but for the most part, you should be able to make some basic sublimation projects using that Easy Press. If you really want to get into sublimation, I recommend getting more of a traditional heat press, a larger heat press. I have a big clamshell press that I absolutely love from Heat Transfer Warehouse, but a swing away press from Amazon, and one of those would work as well. And then if you want to make drinkware, you are going to need a mug press or a tumbler press. There's also sublimation in a convection oven, which is something I'm not going to go into here, but it is something else that you can look at. There are 3 elements that go into the perfect sublimation press: time, temperature, and pressure. So if you're used to working with something like HTV, the material itself will generally tell you the time and temperature, right? If you're using glitter HTV, it's different than if you're using regular HTV. However, with sublimation, it's based on your blank. So if you're putting it on a mug, that will be different than putting it on a t-shirt versus a dog collar. This is why I come back to say, read the manufacturer's instructions. It really is different for every project, and you want to make sure that you're getting it right the first time, because sublimation ink is permanent and there's just no way to get rid of it once you've pressed it. Let's go back a little bit and talk about time, temperature, and pressure. Time is basically how long your project is inside the press being actually pressed. A lot of times this is referred to as dwell time, so you may see that in some tutorials. Then next up is temperature. Sublimation needs very high heat for the sublimation process to work. What basically happens is the sublimation ink is turned into a gas under that high heat, and then it is infused in the polyester or poly coating of your blank. So because of that, it really needs this very high heat to work. Generally, we're talking close to 400 degrees. Sometimes for some blanks, it gets lower to like 365, but generally you're gonna be in the high 300s to 400s range when you are pressing a sublimation blank. And then there is pressure. Most projects require firm, even pressure, and that even pressure is is really important because if you're putting more pressure on one side of the project than the other, you can end up with faded images. Some projects require light pressure, and then some projects require heavy pressure. And for those heavy pressure projects, I really would recommend getting something like a traditional heat press versus your easy press, just because those projects tend to need heavy pressure for long periods of time. It's just very hard to sit there and with your body hold down heavy pressure for like 6 minutes. It's more difficult. So if you really want to get into sublimation and you start deciding it's the craft for you, then maybe look at getting a traditional heat press. All right, that was 5 things you need to know before you start sublimation crafting. So I'd love to know down in the comments, do you think sublimation crafting is for you? Do you want to try a different process? I would love to hear what you think. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and give it a like. Follow my channel for more sublimation, Cricut, and laser crafts. I'll see you next week.